The earthquakes you see in movies are one thing, but real life is a completely different animal. Just because you can't predict an earthquake doesn't mean that you can't prepare for one. In the event of a real earthquake, you should drop, cover, and hold on. Visit ready.gov/earthquake and practice what to do to keep you and your family safe in the event of a real earthquake. And you'll be seen as a hero by your family and your loved ones.
Visit ready.gov/earthquake today.
In Fairfield County, something new comes across my desk every day. Crimes are committed, cases are solved, and a community is made safe by the hardworking employees of the Fairfield County Sheriff's Office. Welcome to This Week with Sheriff Dave Phelan, a weekly program here on LSN Television. We're also carried by a number of the radio affiliates here in Lancaster. Do appreciate you, the viewers and listeners that join us each and every week. This program is actually taped at Fairfield Christian Academy. Our executive producer, Kelly Roberts. The students here take care of the camera work. JT Burcham does a lot of the getting things set up before the show. And I do have a great appreciation for all the folks that put this program together. Back by popular demand, Colonel Tom Moe.
Hi, Dave.
Joined us last week. Tom, a former prisoner of war in Vietnam, and just had a pretty moving story last week about your ordeal you went through in Vietnam. And before we went off the air last week, we talked a little bit about you were in prison for 5 years, tortured, and then you were finally released. And then what happened after you were released and came home?
Well, it was great to be back in the land of the free.
Yes.
My wife remained faithful, raised our little girl for 6 years, saved money that we used to buy our farm here in Fairfield County. My folks were still living, my sisters and my brother. And it was a joyous time and a sober time as well, because a number of my friends had died in prison. Most of them who died were tortured to death. I had lost many friends in the war, and when I came home, learned of their deaths after I had been shot down. So it was mixed emotions, but I was ready to get back to life, and wanted to get back to flying. Wasn't sure if I would be able to, so I went and got a master's degree as sort of a insurance policy, and but then I did return to flying. And I flew fighters again and retired in 1995 after a great 30 years in the Air Force.
Yeah. And in the interim, you've done a lot of great things and worked in county government with me a few years ago.
That's how we first met.
Yeah.
A great experience. Yeah. And a number of jobs since then. And in the 30 years I was in the Air Force, my family grew. My 2 sons were born. And so now I'm blessed by having them and also 6 grandkids. So life is good, and we've gone through life together and just enjoying it.
Now, recently, you've been appointed as commissioner of the World War I Centennial Commission. And what is the Centennial Commission?
Well, 100 years ago, starting in actually 2014, when World War I started in Europe, a commission was formed by the U.S. government, and I had the honor of being appointed to it. There are 12 of us. And our job is to do that exactly, to commemorate the war, remember the sacrifices made in that horrific time. But I think most important, Dave, is that there are lessons to be learned from World War I. You know, we've discussed off camera the forgotten war. I think that the thing that's been forgotten most about World War I is that it set the scene for World War II. Nothing was resolved in World War I. And through those 2 wars, the world was shaped to the way it is today in a bad way. The problems we're seeing in the Middle East, the divisions of the Middle East, the changing of powers, the rise of communism, all that, the seeds were sown in World War I, and we're still suffering from that around the world.
World War I in Europe actually started with an assassination.
That was certainly a spark. There had been tensions building throughout Europe for a number of years. even starting with the 30 Years' War, war between basically Catholics and Protestants as to the dominating religion. Then the rise of Germany as a country in the 1800s, hadn't even existed as a country before then. And then finally, this powerful Germany was causing anxiety among the other powers. There had been territorial disputes in the Balkans, which led to the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand of Austria. And tensions just kept building, and no one was willing to step down. And after the assassination, the real line in the sand, so to speak, was that an ultimatum was given to Serbia to basically make amends for this assassination. And Serbia acquiesced in most cases of the ultimatum, but not all of them. So countries started declaring war with each other. And the sadness of this whole thing, besides the sadness of the war, after the war got started, these same leaders were asking each other, how did this happen? Why are we fighting each other? Three of the prime leaders in Europe, the Tsar, the King, and the Kaiser of Germany, were cousins. They were blood relatives through Queen Victoria, and they were killing each other. 10,000, 20,000 deaths an hour. Horrible.
Yeah, yeah. And so you had this terrible war, and in fact, they said it was the war to end all wars, if I'm not mistaken, and they thought that was going to be it.
They thought it was going to be it. As a matter of fact, President Wilson, for his second electoral campaign, pledged to keep us out of the war. His slogan was, I kept us out of war, or he kept us out of war. And yet, because of the rising tensions and the fact that the U.S. kept sailing in harm's way, the Lusitania, for example, was sunk, a British ship with American passengers. America was warned not to sail on that ship because it was sailing in hostile waters. It was sunk. But even then, it wasn't for another couple of years until President Wilson broke his pledge and got us involved in World War I, which may have been the worst thing that could have happened.
You know, I just finished reading the Lusitania, a new book out by Eric Larson.
I've read it.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, Dark Wake, I believe, is it called?
Yeah.
It is fascinating.
Yeah. So it talks a little bit about some of the things you just described. Mm-hmm. So you talk about lessons learned. What are the lessons learned?
Well, the lessons learned, first of all, was that the Europeans had beat themselves to death by 1917, 1918. They were ready to quit. If anybody had the edge, it was maybe Germany a little bit, only because their territory had not been invaded, okay, or not been, they hadn't been fought. I shouldn't say invaded, because the Germans did their fair share of invading other countries. But everybody was hurting. At the same time, another thing that's forgotten from that era, there was a huge flu epidemic that killed more people than World War I did, more than casualties on the battlefield. So the U.S. entered, tipped the balance, and Wilson, rather idealistic, thought that this would be the war to end all wars. The League of Nations could be set up, and everybody would settle things peacefully. Once the U.S. had tipped the balance, the Europeans, the British and the French, thumbed their nose at him, like, who's he type of thing, and they proceeded to absolutely pillage Germany. Literally took manufacturing equipment away. They suffered horrific reparations, and so nothing was settled. The Middle East was divided up. Maps were drawn and lines drawn by people who didn't even live there. Yeah. And so we had World War II.
And you know, I look at the Allied powers and the Central powers, and it's funny because you look at some of the countries that were part of allies with us, Japan, Russia, and how today things have really changed, and even into World War I, how those alliances shifted.
Indeed. As a matter of fact, we were allies with the Soviet Union in World War II.
Right.
And should have been. World War II was a whole different story. The U.S. had to be involved to stop the spread of fascism, the massacre of millions of people by the Nazi Party. But yes, those alliances, how they shift. And to this day, by the way, one of the countries in the world that might surprise everyone that's begging us to return militarily is Vietnam, because of the threat from China.
Have you been back to Vietnam since you left?
No, I'd love to. It's a beautiful country and beautiful people.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely amazing when you look at the time you were there, when the time you were prisoner of war. and the division of what we saw in that country, and how today you will see clothing, you'll see items that were produced by Vietnam.
Yeah.
It's just, to me, an amazing, something amazing that has happened in 40, 50 years.
It is.
Yeah.
Still a totalitarian government, but they understand that the communist system really doesn't work. So they got an iron fist over their people, but they're allowing manufacturing, more or less freedom of movement. They're going to open up the internet, and they're wanting U.S. Navy warships to sail in there. So times change.
So what are some of the things that the Commission's going to be doing in the next few years?
I suppose there's two main prongs. One is to commemorate, to honor the memory of people who served, who died there, tremendous casualties, to remind people of the history, and that's the second part, the education. Our website is excellent. I'm going to have to put my glasses on to read it off to you, but I'd like your listeners to go to it. It's worldwide-1centennial.org, preceded by WWW.
Right.
And there are lesson plans for adults and children. It's professionally run so that we can properly commemorate and educate people of the things that we've been talking about.
And why do you think that, like, I think I mentioned before that, people have they know a lot about the Civil War, they know a lot about World War II, Vietnam, but people really don't seem to have an interest or know a lot about World War I. Do you think it's because it's now been 100 years removed? But of course, the Civil War's been longer than that. So.
The Civil War was fought here.
Yeah.
Tremendous divisions that exist to this day. World War II was cataclysmic and definitely affected the entire world, obviously, much more obviously than World War I did. The fact that it was really World War I and World War II were a progression of the same war, basically, with a little pause in between. World War I tends to be eclipsed. Even just when studying the causes of World War I, it's mind-boggling. It'd be nice to say, well, these people invaded here and these people invaded there, like a chess game. It was extremely complicated, tensions building up over 150 years. I think all that clouds the issue. And just look at the public knowledge, movies about World War II all over the place, and media, of course, came of age after World War II. So back after World War I, movie cameras existed, but not a lot of information.
Yeah, I haven't seen this movie, but I was told by former Chief Dave Bailey of the Lancaster Police Department that probably one of the better movies he's seen on World War I was a movie called War Horse.
I've seen it. It's quite good.
Yeah. He said as far as, and you don't see a lot of movies about World War I, but he said that movie in and of itself was pretty good.
Yeah. So. There are more films being made now about the war. Of course, as I said, after World War I, there wasn't a lot being done because the media was immature. Flyboys is quite good, fairly true about the fighter effort in Europe. But the definitive story needs to be told just as we've had stories about the Civil War and World War II. Ken Burns should think about that. Yeah. We've talked to him, by the way.
Yeah, that would be a good one.
We're still working on him.
Hey, we're just about out of time. Do appreciate you being with us the last couple of weeks. We'd like to have you back in the future sometime. I'll tell you, I've learned a lot in the last couple of weeks just listening to you, and I'm sure the viewers and listeners feel the same way. Real war hero, patriot, Colonel Tom Moe, retired United States Air Force, but active every day, it sounds like.
Still cooking.
Still cooking. Well, the clock on the wall says we're just about out of time. Do appreciate the students here at Fairfield Christian Academy, our executive producer behind the scenes, Kelly Roberts, and certainly you, the viewers and listeners that join us each and every week. Until next week, same time, same place. If you're driving, buckle up, be careful, and we'll see you right here next week, and God bless.
Taking care of a family member can lead to plenty of questions. Fortunately, there's a place to get the answers, for them and for you. Find articles, tips, and tools from experts and others who have been in your place. The Caregiving Resource Center at aarp.org/caregiving.